Welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade gently into the background. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen. Together tonight, we will wander through the wide plains and river valleys of ancient India, through quiet villages and busy river ports, through the courts of kings and the homes of ordinary families who lived, worked, and rested long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath in and let it out even more slowly. Feel your shoulders soften. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift. Tonight, our journey begins in the centuries after the death of a young conqueror far to the west, in a land of green rivers and old forests, where a boy named Chandragupta was about to change the shape of a subcontinent, quietly, patiently, and almost without our notice, the way history often does. If these slow journeys through the past help you rest, you are welcome to subscribe, so that we might continue wandering through old worlds together on future evenings. For now, let your eyes rest, let your breathing slow, and let the ancient world of the Mauryas begin to carry you toward sleep. Long before any single ruler claimed the whole of the Indian subcontinent, the land itself had already been shaping the lives of its people for thousands of years. To understand how an empire could rise here, it helps to first understand the land, because in ancient India, geography was never simply background. It was the quiet architect of everything that followed. Picture, if you will, a vast triangular landmass, bordered in the north by the great arc of the Himalayan mountains, their snow line catching the earliest light of morning long before the valleys below ever see the sun. These mountains were more than scenery. They were a wall, a source of rivers, and in the minds of the people who lived beneath them, a dwelling place of gods. From their glaciers came the waters that would make everything else possible. Two rivers in particular deserve our quiet attention tonight, because they will return again and again throughout this story. The first is the Indus, flowing generally southward through what is now Pakistan, a river so old and so central to this land that the very word India descends from its name. The second is the Ganges, or Ganga, curling eastward and then southeastward across the northern plains, gathering smaller rivers into itself like a slow-moving hand cupping water, where the Ganges meets the Yamuna, and later where it reaches the sea in the Bengal Delta. The soil is dark, moist, and extraordinarily fertile. It was here, along the middle and lower reaches of the Ganges, in a region historians often call the Gangetic Plain, that some of the earliest and most powerful kingdoms of ancient India took root. By the 6th century before the Common Era, this plain was already home to a patchwork of small kingdoms and tribal republics, a political landscape that later Buddhist and Jain texts remember as the 16 Mahajanapadas, or Great Realms. Among these, one kingdom in particular grew steadily more powerful than its neighbors. That was Magadha, centered in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, its heartland cradled between the Ganges to the north and low, forested hills to the south. Magadha possessed several quiet advantages that history would eventually reward. Its soil was rich enough to support dense populations and reliable harvests of rice. Its hills held iron ore, and with iron came stronger tools, stronger plows, and eventually stronger weapons. Its position along the Ganges gave it access to river trade that could move grain, cloth, and goods across enormous distances with far less effort than carrying them overland. It is worth pausing here in the stillness of this early evening to imagine what daily life might have felt like in such a kingdom, long before any Mauryan emperor was born. In the villages that dotted the Gangetic plain, most families lived by agriculture, following a rhythm dictated not by kings or wars, but by the monsoon. The monsoon winds arrived from the southwest, usually in June, bringing months of rain that filled the rivers, softened the soil, and made rice cultivation possible on a scale that fed enormous populations. Farmers plowed with oxen, planted rice in flooded paddies, and later grew wheat, barley, lentils, and sesame in the drier months. Villages were generally small, built around a central well or tank of water, with homes made of mud brick, wood, and thatched roofs of straw or palm leaf. Cattle were central to rural life, providing milk, labor for plowing, and dung that was dried and used as fuel. Family life in these early agrarian communities tended to be organized around extended households, with several generations often sharing the same compound. Children were expected to help with agricultural work from a young age, though this varied considerably depending on caste and social position. A system of social organization that was already becoming more rigid during this period. Education, where it existed formally, was often religious in nature, conducted by Brahmin priests who taught Vedic hymns, rituals, and later philosophical texts to the sons of higher status families, while practical skills such as farming, pottery, weaving, carpentry, and metalworking were passed down within families and craft communities, often organized into what would later be recognized as guilds. Religion during this era was undergoing a quiet but profound transformation. The older Vedic tradition, centered on elaborate sacrificial rituals performed by Brahmin priests, was being questioned and reshaped by new spiritual movements. It was during roughly this period, in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, that two figures emerged whose teachings would echo for millennia. One was Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha, teaching a path of moderation between luxury and self-denial, encouraging his followers to understand suffering and to seek liberation from it through ethical living, meditation, and wisdom. The other was Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara of Jainism, who taught a path of strict nonviolence, truthfulness, and detachment from material possessions. Both traditions found fertile ground in the Gangetic plain, partly because they offered spiritual paths that did not depend on the expensive rituals and social hierarchies of Vedic Brahmanism, and partly because the growing merchant and trading classes of this era found in them a philosophy well suited to urban, commercial life. Trade itself was becoming increasingly important during this period. Along the rivers and along a growing network of overland routes, merchants moved cotton textiles, iron tools, salt, spices, precious stones, and agricultural surplus between cities. Some of these routes would later be absorbed into what became known as the Uttarapatha, the Great Northern Road, and the Dakshinapatha, the Great Southern Road, arteries of commerce that connected the subcontinent from the northwest frontier down toward the peninsula. Cities grew up along these routes and along the rivers. Cities such as Rajagriha, the early capital of Magadha nestled among protective hills, and later Pataliputra, which would eventually become one of the great cities of the ancient world. Magadha's rise to dominance did not happen quickly or dramatically. It unfolded across generations through a series of ambitious rulers who expanded the kingdom's borders through warfare, diplomacy, and marriage alliances. Historians point to King Bindusara and later his son Ajatashatru as particularly important figures in this early expansion. During the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era, Ajatashatru is remembered, according to later Buddhist and Jain accounts, as a ruler who employed new and more effective siege technologies against rival cities, including what some texts describe as an early mechanized catapult and a covered chariot fitted with something resembling a mace. Though historians caution that these details come from religious texts written sometime after the events they describe and should be treated as tradition rather than confirmed fact. Over the following century and a half, the throne of Magadha passed through several dynasties. Eventually, by the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, power came into the hands of a dynasty remembered as the Nandas. The Nanda rulers, and particularly a king remembered by later sources as Mahapadma Nanda, expanded Magadha's territory very significantly, bringing much of the northern plain under a single centralized authority, and reportedly amassing an army and treasury of extraordinary size. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, drawing on second-hand accounts from the time of Alexander's campaigns in the northwest of the subcontinent, describe the Nanda army as enormous, though the specific numbers that survive in these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated, as was common in ancient descriptions of rival powers. The Nanda dynasty, however, does not appear to have been especially beloved by many of its subjects. Later traditions, including both Buddhist and later Sanskrit sources, describe the Nandas as having imposed heavy taxation and as having come from a lower social background than earlier ruling dynasties, which seems to have generated resentment among some of the traditional elite. It is against this backdrop, in a kingdom that was wealthy, powerful, centralized, and yet according to tradition, increasingly unpopular among certain segments of its population, that our central figures begin to emerge. Far to the northwest, in the borderlands where the subcontinent meets the highlands of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, a very different drama was unfolding at almost exactly this same moment in history. In 327 and 326 before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon, having already conquered the Persian Empire, led his army across the Hindu Kush Mountains and into the Indus Valley. He fought a difficult and costly battle against a regional king named Porus along the banks of the Hydaspes River, a battle in which, according to Greek accounts, Alexander was deeply impressed by the courage of his opponent, and after victory, restored Porus to his throne as a subject ally rather than removing him entirely. Alexander's soldiers, however, exhausted after years of campaigning far from home, refused to march further east toward the Ganges, where they had heard reports of the vast and powerful Nanda kingdom awaiting them. And so Alexander turned back, leaving behind a scattering of Greek garrisons and administrators in the northwest, before he himself would die in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era. Still a young man, his vast empire almost immediately beginning to fracture among his rival generals. It is into this particular moment, this narrow window of history, when Alexander's presence had destabilized the northwest frontier, and the Nanda dynasty sat, wealthy but resented, upon the throne of Magadha, that our central figure enters the story. His name, as remembered by later tradition, was Chandragupta, and the details of his early life remain genuinely uncertain, pieced together from fragments in later Sanskrit political texts, Buddhist chronicles, Jain traditions, and the writings of Greek and Roman authors who had access, directly or indirectly, to accounts from travelers who visited India during this period. According to several traditions, Chandragupta came from a family of modest or uncertain status. Some accounts suggesting connections to a clan associated with peacock keeping, which later gave rise to the dynastic name Maurya, a term some scholars connect to the Sanskrit word for peacock, Mayura, though this etymology, like much about his early life, is debated among historians rather than firmly established. What is more consistently reported across multiple traditions is that Chandragupta came into contact, likely while still a young man, with a Brahmin scholar and strategist remembered by the name Chanakya, also known in later tradition as Kautilya, a figure who would become one of the most significant political theorists in the history of the subcontinent. The stories of how Chanakya and Chandragupta first met vary considerably, depending on which ancient source one consults, and historians generally treat the more dramatic versions of these stories, involving personal insults at the Nanda court and vows of revenge, as later literary embellishment rather than verified history. What does seem reasonably well supported, however, is that Chanakya became Chandragupta's mentor, advisor, and, according to tradition, the architect of a long and patient campaign to overthrow the Nanda dynasty and place Chandragupta upon the throne of Magadha instead. We will follow that campaign and the empire it eventually built, gently and slowly across the segments ahead. For now, as this first quiet chapter draws to its close, simply let yourself rest in the image of that ancient river plain. The wide brown waters of the Ganges moving unhurried toward the sea, the green paddies stretching toward a horizon of low hills, the smoke of evening cooking fires rising from 1,000 small villages, and somewhere among them, a young man and his teacher beginning, patiently and quietly, to imagine a different future for the land they called home. We left our story beside the wide waters of the Ganges, with a young man named Chandragupta and his mentor Chanakya beginning to imagine a different future for the kingdom of Magadha. Let us continue that story now, slowly, the way a river continues its course, without hurry, without struggle, simply following the shape of the land. According to the traditions that have come down to us, Chandragupta's path to the throne did not begin in Magadha itself, but in the northwest, in the unsettled years following Alexander's withdrawal from the Indus Valley. Some ancient sources, including later Roman writers drawing on earlier Greek accounts, suggest that Chandragupta may have encountered Alexander himself, or at least observed the Macedonian presence in the region during this period of his life, though historians treat this claim with caution, since the surviving accounts are brief, second-hand, and written well after the events they describe. What seems more secure is that Chandragupta spent time in the northwest during the years after Alexander's departure, a period when the Greek garrisons left behind were struggling to maintain control over a restless and unfamiliar land. It was in this unstable environment, according to tradition, that Chandragupta began assembling a following drawing support from frontier communities, from remnants of local resistance to Greek and Persian-influenced rule, and, as the stories suggest, from Chanakya's careful strategic planning. The historian's task here is a delicate one, because so much of what survives about this period comes from later texts written centuries afterward, texts with their own purposes and their own audiences. The Arthashastra, a detailed treatise on statecraft, economics, and military strategy, traditionally attributed to Chanakya himself, offers a remarkable window into the political thinking of this era. Though scholars continue to debate how much of the text, as it survives today, reflects the original composition versus later additions and revisions made over subsequent centuries, what the historical record allows us to say with reasonable confidence is this: sometime around 322 before the Common Era, though the exact date remains a matter of scholarly discussion, Chandragupta succeeded in overthrowing the last Nanda ruler and claiming the throne of Magadha for himself. The details of this campaign, the the specific battles fought, the alliances formed and broken, are largely lost to us, preserved only in fragments and later legendary retellings that blend historical memory with the storytelling conventions of the genres in which they were written. What is clear is the outcome. A new dynasty, the Mauryan dynasty, now controlled the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in the Gangetic plain, with its capital at Pataliputra, a city that would grow over the following decades into one of the largest and most impressive urban centers anywhere in the ancient world. Let us pause here and imagine Pataliputra as it must have appeared during these early Mauryan years, because it deserves our unhurried attention. The city sat at the confluence of the Ganges and the Sun rivers, a position that gave it natural protection on several sides, while also placing it at the heart of a vast network of river trade. According to Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador who would visit the Mauryan court some years later, and whose writings, though surviving only in fragments quoted by later authors, remain one of our most valuable sources for this period. Pataliputra was surrounded by a massive wooden palisade wall, punctured by hundreds of towers and dozens of gates, with a wide moat beyond it that also served practical purposes of sanitation and defense. Modern archaeological excavations near the city of Patna, which occupies much of the ancient site today, have uncovered substantial wooden foundations and timber structures consistent with these ancient descriptions, lending real archaeological support to Megasthenes' account. Even though much of the ancient city likely lies beneath the modern city and remains difficult to excavate fully, within this vast fortified city, life proceeded according to the same gentle rhythms that governed cities across the ancient world, only on a grander scale than most. Megasthenes describes an administration organized with remarkable attention to detail, including, according to his account, specific municipal officials responsible for matters such as trade regulation, craft supervision, tax collection, care of foreigners, and even a kind of early public health oversight related to births and deaths within the city, though historians note that Megasthenes may have systematized or idealized certain aspects of Mauryan administration in ways that reflected his own Greek assumptions about good governance as much as the actual practice on the ground. Trade flourished under this new centralized authority. The Mauryan state, inheriting and expanding upon administrative structures that had already existed under the Nandas, appears to have taken an active role in regulating markets, standardizing weights and measures, and collecting taxes on agricultural production and craft goods. The Arthashastra describes, in considerable detail, an economy in which the state involved itself deeply in matters of production and trade, including state-run workshops, mines, and agricultural estates, alongside private commerce conducted by merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. whether this text describes the actual practice of Chandragupta's government or represents more of an idealized model that later rulers only partially implemented remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion. But even as an aspirational document, it reveals a level of administrative sophistication and economic thinking that was remarkable for its time. Beyond the walls of Pataliputra, Chandragupta's early reign was also marked by a significant military and diplomatic episode involving the wider Hellenistic world. Following the death of Alexander, his vast conquests had fractured among his generals, a group of men later remembered as the Diadachi, or successors. One of these generals, Seleucus, eventually established control over the eastern portions of Alexander's former empire, including the territories bordering the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Around 305 before the Common Era, Seleucus led a military campaign eastward, apparently attempting to reassert control over the Indus Valley region that Alexander had briefly touched. What followed was a conflict between Seleucus and Chandragupta, the details of which are frustratingly sparse in the surviving sources. But the outcome is recorded with reasonable consistency across multiple ancient accounts. Rather than continuing a costly war, Seleucus and Chandragupta reached a negotiated settlement. Seleucus ceded significant territories in the northwest, generally understood to include areas of what is now eastern Afghanistan and parts of the Indus Valley region to the Mauryan Empire. In exchange, Chandragupta reportedly provided Seleucus with a substantial number of war elephants, 500 according to several ancient sources, animals that would later play an important role in Seleucus's own military campaigns further west, including, according to tradition, his victory at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 before the Common Era. The agreement was further sealed, according to some ancient sources, by a marriage alliance between the two ruling families, though the precise nature of this arrangement is described only vaguely in the sources that survive, leaving historians uncertain about its exact terms. This treaty holds a particular significance for us tonight, not simply as a political event, but as the doorway through which one of our most valuable windows into Mauryan society opens. As part of this diplomatic arrangement, Seleucus sent an ambassador to reside at the Mauryan court in Pataliputra. That ambassador was Megasthenes, and though his original work, called the Indica, has not survived in complete form, later Greek and Roman authors, including Strabo, Arrian, and Diodorus Siculus, quoted extensively from it in their own writings, preserving fragments that give us a rare outsider's perspective on Mauryan India during this early and formative period of the empire. Through these fragments, we catch glimpses of daily life among ordinary people during Chandragupta's reign that feel remarkably vivid even across the distance of more than 2,000 years. Megasthenes describes a society organized, in his understanding, into several broad occupational groups, including philosophers and priests, farmers, herdsmen and hunters, craftsmen and traders, soldiers, overseers, and counselors. Though modern historians caution that this framework likely reflects a simplified Greek attempt to categorize the far more complex and fluid social and caste structures that actually existed in India, structures that Megasthenes, as a foreign visitor with limited language access, would have understood only partially. He notes with apparent admiration that farmers in the Mauryan realm were protected during times of war, that soldiers were forbidden from damaging agricultural land or harming farmers even during military campaigns, an observation that, if accurate, suggests a society that placed considerable value on agricultural stability as the foundation of its prosperity. He also describes India as remarkably free of famine during this period compared to other regions he was familiar with, attributing this to the reliability of monsoon rains and the effectiveness of irrigation. Though of course droughts and agricultural hardship certainly did occur across Indian history, and we should be cautious about treating a foreign visitor's impressions as a complete picture of a vast and varied land. As evening settles more deeply now, let us imagine the quieter textures of life in this early Mauryan world, in the countryside surrounding Pataliputra, and across the wider Gangetic plain now unified under Mauryan rule. Farming families continued much as their ancestors had, rising before dawn to tend to cattle, working rice paddies through the warm months, harvesting in the cooler season, and gathering in the evenings around small fires to share simple meals of rice, lentils, and vegetables, seasoned with what spices were available and affordable. Clothing for most people was simple, woven cotton for the majority of the population, unstitched garments wrapped and draped in styles that would remain recognizable in India for centuries afterward. While wealthier households might afford finer textiles, some dyed in the deep reds and yellows that Indian dye makers had already become known for producing. Children in farming households grew up surrounded by extended family, learning agricultural skills, animal husbandry, and household crafts through daily participation rather than formal instruction, while in wealthier or Brahmin households, and increasingly within Buddhist monastic communities that were spreading across the region, more formal education in reading, writing, religious texts, and eventually mathematics and astronomy became available to those with access to it. Writing itself, using scripts that would eventually develop into the Brahmi script that Ashoka's later inscriptions would famously employ, was becoming an increasingly important tool of both religious transmission and administrative record-keeping during this period. Even as much of Indian intellectual and religious tradition continued to be preserved and transmitted orally through careful memorization for many centuries afterward. Chandragupta's reign, by most historical accounts, lasted approximately 24 years, a period during which the Mauryan state consolidated its control over the Gangetic plain, expanded westward and northwestward following the treaty with Seleucus, and began extending its influence southward into the Deccan Plateau as well, though the full extent of Mauryan control over the southern regions of the subcontinent during Chandragupta's own lifetime remains somewhat uncertain and is pieced together from later inscriptions and indirect evidence rather than detailed contemporary accounts. One further tradition deserves gentle mention here, though historians treat it with appropriate caution, given its late attestation. Jain traditions, recorded some centuries after the events they describe, hold that in his later years, Chandragupta abdicated his throne, embraced Jain asceticism under the guidance of a teacher remembered as Bhadrabahu, and traveled south to a hill in what is now the state of Karnataka, known today as Shravanabelagola, where he is said to have ended his life through a Jain practice of ritual fasting called Salikhana. Whether this tradition reflects genuine historical memory or later religious elaboration designed to associate Jainism with a great and successful emperor remains an open question among historians, though the site itself does contain ancient Jain inscriptions and remains an important pilgrimage destination to this day. As Chandragupta's reign draws to its quiet close in our story tonight, the throne of Magadha and the vast territories now attached to it would pass to his son. Let that transition settle gently in your mind, the way authority in any age passes from one generation to the next, sometimes with turbulence, but here, according to what evidence survives, with reasonable continuity. We will follow that next generation and the further expansion of this remarkable empire as our journey continues. Before we follow the Mauryan story forward into the reign of Chandragupta's successors, let us slow down even further and spend this chapter simply resting within the daily life of the empire itself. Empires, after all, are not truly made of thrones and treaties. They are made of millions of small, quiet lives, lived one ordinary day after another. And it is worth our time tonight to imagine some of those lives with care. Consider, first, the geography of the empire as it stood in these early Mauryan decades, because geography shaped everything about how people lived. The Gangetic plain, the empire's heartland, is a vast alluvial floodplain, built up over thousands of years by sediment carried down from the Himalayas. This soil, dark and mineral rich, made the plain one of the most agriculturally productive regions anywhere in the ancient world, capable of supporting population densities that few other regions could match. To the west lay the Indus Valley, itself an ancient cradle of civilization, now brought under Mauryan control through Chandragupta's treaty with Seleucus. To the south, beyond the Vindhya mountain range, lay the Deccan Plateau, a drier, harder landscape of red laterite soil, forests, and mineral wealth, including iron and, further south, gold and precious stones. a region that Mauryan influence was gradually extending into during this period, though with less administrative density than the Gangetic core. Seasons governed nearly everything about how people in this world experience time. The year moved through three broad divisions familiar to agricultural societies across South Asia. A hot, dry season beginning around March and building through May. The monsoon season, arriving with the southwest winds in June and continuing, with regional variation, into September, bringing the rains upon which nearly all agriculture depended, and a cooler, drier season from October through February, during which much of the harvest took place and travel became easier across roads that had been softened or flooded during the rains. Farmers timed their planting and harvesting around this rhythm with careful, inherited knowledge, passed down through generations of observation rather than written instruction, watching the behavior of birds, the flowering of certain trees, and the movement of clouds to anticipate the monsoon's arrival. In a typical village of this era, whether in the Gangetic heartland or in more distant provinces, life centered around a cluster of homes, usually built from mud brick or wattle and daub construction, with roofs thatched from rice straw, palm leaves, or reeds, depending on local availability. Archaeological excavations at Mauryan era sites, including work conducted near Pataliputra and at other sites across the Gangetic plain, have revealed evidence of these humble domestic structures alongside more substantial public buildings, giving us a physical sense of the contrast between everyday homes and the grander architecture of temples, administrative buildings, and city walls. A village well or water tank typically served as a central gathering point, not only for drawing water, but for the informal social life of the community, where news was exchanged, where children played in the cooler hours of morning and evening, and where the practical business of daily life unfolded. Most families kept some combination of cattle, water buffalo, goats, or chickens, animals that provided milk, labor, and occasionally meat. Though vegetarianism was already a significant and growing practice among segments of the population, encouraged by the ethical teachings of Buddhism and Jainism, which emphasized nonviolence toward living beings, a principle known as ahimsa that would become increasingly influential in Indian culture over the following centuries, and which, as we will see in later chapters, would eventually come to deeply influence Mauryan imperial policy itself. The rice paddies that surrounded many Gangetic villages required careful and cooperative labor. Fields needed to be leveled and bordered with small earthen dikes to hold water during the flooded growing season. A system of paddy agriculture that demanded coordination among neighboring families, since water management for one field inevitably affected the fields around it. This cooperative dimension of agricultural life likely reinforced strong community bonds within villages, even as social hierarchies based on caste, wealth, and occupation shaped relationships between different families and groups within the same community. Beyond rice, farmers in this period cultivated a wide variety of other crops depending on soil and season, including wheat and barley in drier areas and cooler months, along with lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes that helped replenish soil nutrients and provided important sources of protein in a diet that, for most people, contained meat only occasionally. Sugarcane was cultivated and processed into a range of sweeteners. Cotton was grown extensively, particularly in drier regions, and Indian cotton textiles, dyed using techniques including indigo for blue and various plant and mineral sources for red, yellow, and other colors, were already gaining renown that would eventually make Indian textiles a major item of international trade for centuries to come. Sesame provided oil for cooking and for lamps, and various spices, including ginger, pepper from the southern regions, and other aromatics, flavored food, and were beginning to enter into trade networks that would eventually stretch as far as the Mediterranean world. Let us turn now to matters of craft and trade, because Mauryan India supported a remarkably sophisticated array of skilled artisans. Archaeological evidence, particularly a distinctive and beautifully finished type of pottery known as northern black polished ware, found across sites throughout the Gangetic plain and dating to roughly this period, points to highly skilled specialized pottery production, likely organized through professional workshops rather than purely household-level craft. Metalworkers produced iron tools and weapons, taking advantage of the iron ore deposits found in the hills of Magadha and surrounding regions, as well as bronze and copper vessels, ornaments, and implements. Goldsmiths and jewelers crafted ornaments from gold sourced from southern India and beyond, along with gemstones including carnelian, agate, and other semi-precious stones. Some worked into beads through techniques of remarkable precision that archaeologists have recovered from sites across the subcontinent. Textile production, as mentioned, was another major craft industry, involving not only the growing and spinning of cotton, but also silk, which arrived in India through trade connections extending toward Central Asia and eventually China. Though the silk trade along what would later be called the Silk Road was still developing during this early period and would grow considerably in subsequent centuries. Woodworkers, working with the abundant timber of the Gangetic forests and beyond, produced everything from simple household furniture to the elaborate wooden palisades and structures that, as we heard in the previous chapter, made up much of Pataliputra's early architecture. These craftspeople, along with merchants who moved goods between cities and regions, appear to have organized themselves into associations, sometimes referred to in later texts as shrenis, groups that functioned somewhat like professional guilds, regulating standards of craft, negotiating collectively with authorities, and in some cases, even functioning as informal banking institutions. holding deposits, and extending credit within their communities. The Arthashastra, in describing an idealized model of Mauryan economic administration, discusses state oversight of trade and craft production in considerable detail, including regulations governing weights, measures, prices, and the quality of goods, along with a system of taxation that funded the considerable expenses of maintaining the imperial administration, army, and public infrastructure. Trade routes connected these craft centers and agricultural regions into a wider commercial network. Rivers served as the primary highways of the Gangetic plain, with boats carrying grain, textiles, pottery, and other goods far more efficiently than overland transport, which relied on ox carts moving along roads that, according to Megasthenes' account, the Mauryan state took some responsibility for maintaining, including the placement of distance markers along major routes, a level of infrastructure investment that impressed this foreign observer considerably. Overland routes connected the Gangetic plain to the northwest frontier, where trade continued to flow towards Central Asia, and indirectly toward the Hellenistic world that Chandragupta's treaty with Seleucus had brought into closer diplomatic contact with India. Southward routes connected the plain to the Deccan Plateau, and eventually to the southern tip of the subcontinent, along which moved goods including gold, precious stones, and eventually spices that were already beginning to attract the interest of traders from further afield. Let us dwell for a moment gently on matters of family and daily domestic life. Since these details, though less dramatic than treaties and conquests, are the true substance of how most people in this era actually experienced their world. Marriage customs varied by region, caste, and community, but generally involved arrangements made between families, with ceremonies incorporating religious rituals appropriate to the family's faith. Whether rooted in Vedic Brahminical tradition, Buddhist practice, Jain observance, or the many regional and folk religious traditions that coexisted throughout the subcontinent during this era of considerable religious diversity and, generally speaking, coexistence. Within households, women's roles varied considerably by social class and region. In agricultural families, women typically participated actively in fieldwork alongside domestic responsibilities, including food preparation, textile production, and childcare. While in wealthier households, domestic labor might be performed by servants, and women's daily activities might center more around household management, religious observance, and, for some, education in music, literature, or religious texts. Megasthenes notes, with apparent interest, several details about Mauryan court life, including the presence of women serving in roles connected to the palace guard. Details that, while filtered through his outsider's perspective, suggest a degree of complexity in women's roles within Mauryan society that resists simple generalization. Children's daily lives centered around helping with household and agricultural tasks appropriate to their age. playing games that archaeological evidence, including small clay toys and gaming pieces found at sites across the region, suggests were an important part of childhood across social classes. Formal education, as mentioned in our earlier chapter, was more consistently available to children of Brahmin families and to those who entered Buddhist monastic communities, which by this period were becoming increasingly important centers of learning, offering education in religious philosophy, ethics, logic, and eventually a wide range of other subjects to students regardless of their caste background, a genuinely significant feature of Buddhist monastic education that set it apart from more caste-restricted forms of learning. As we bring this chapter to a gentle close, let us hold in our minds this fuller picture of the Mauryan world during Chandragupta's reign and the years immediately following, not simply a story of kings and treaties, but a vast, living network of farming families tending rice paddies beneath monsoon skies, craftspeople shaping clay and metal and cloth in workshops along riverbanks, merchants guiding ox carts and river boats along ancient trade routes, and children playing in the dust of village courtyards as the sun set slowly behind fields of ripening grain. This was the true foundation upon which the Mauryan Empire rested, and it is this same foundation that Chandragupta's successors would inherit and attempt, each in their own way, to govern, expand, and eventually transform. With the texture of everyday Mauryan life now gently settled in our minds, let us return to the flow of dynastic history and follow the throne of Magadha as it passes, sometime around 297 before the Common Era, from Chandragupta to his son, a ruler remembered by the name Bindusara. Bindusara's reign is, in truth, one of the more thinly documented periods of Mauryan history, a gap in the record that historians have long found somewhat puzzling, given how much material survives concerning both his father's founding of the empire and his son's later transformation of it. What we do know comes from scattered references in later texts, brief mentions in Greek and Roman sources, and inference drawn from the territorial extent of the empire as it existed by the time it passed into the hands of Bindusara's own successor. Rather than treating this scarcity of detail as an obstacle, let us treat it instead as an invitation to imagine, carefully and with appropriate humility, about the limits of our knowledge, what this middle period of Mauryan history might have looked and felt like. Ancient sources suggest that Bindusara continued and likely expanded the diplomatic relationships his father had established with the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west. The Seleucid ambassador Megasthenes, as we discussed earlier, had resided at Chandragupta's court, and later Greek sources indicate that diplomatic contact continued during Bindusara's reign as well. A Greek writer named Damachus is mentioned in later sources as having served as an ambassador at Bindusara's court, sent by Antiochus I, the son and successor of Seleucus, continuing the pattern of diplomatic exchange between the Mauryan and Seleucid realms. Additionally, later classical sources, including a brief but intriguing reference preserved by the historian Athenaeus, suggest that Bindusara maintained correspondence with the Hellenistic world that touched on matters of philosophy. And even, according to one often cited anecdote, involved a request for certain Greek goods, including, according to this source, sweet wine, dried figs, and a sophist, or philosopher, to be sent to his court, a request to which the Seleucid ruler reportedly responded that while wine and figs could certainly be sent, sophists were not something the Greeks considered appropriate items of trade. Historians treat this particular anecdote with some caution, as it survives through a chain of later citation rather than a contemporary source. But it nonetheless offers a charming glimpse of the kind of cultural curiosity and exchange that seems to have characterized relations between the Mauryan court and the wider Hellenistic world during this period. In terms of territorial expansion, later inscriptions and textual references, particularly those associated with Bindusara's own son Ashoka, suggest that the Mauryan Empire's southward expansion into the Deccan Plateau continued significantly during Bindusara's reign. Some later traditions credit Bindusara with extending Mauryan authority deep into the southern regions of the subcontinent, though the exact extent and nature of this control, whether direct administrative governance or a looser form of tributary overlordship, remains a matter of scholarly discussion, since detailed contemporary documentation from this specific period is limited. What does seem reasonably clear, based on the geographic scope of territories mentioned in later Ashokan inscriptions, is that by the end of Bindusara's reign, the Mauryan Empire had grown to encompass a truly vast portion of the Indian subcontinent, stretching from the northwest frontier regions gained through the treaty with Seleucus, across the entire Gangetic plain, and southward well into the Deccan Plateau, leaving only the southernmost regions of the peninsula, home to kingdoms such as the Cholas, Pandyas, and Chiras, along with certain other areas outside of direct Mauryan control. Let us imagine, for a moment, what it might have meant to administer a realm of this scale during this era, using the technologies and communication methods available at the time. Governing such a vast territory required a sophisticated administrative structure, one that later Ashokan inscriptions give us some direct evidence about, even though those inscriptions date from the following reign. The empire appears to have been organized into several major provinces, each governed by a viceroy, often a member of the royal family, based in a provincial capital. Major provincial centers included Taxila in the northwest, an ancient city with deep roots as a center of learning and trade that had already existed for centuries before Mauryan rule, and would continue to serve as an important cultural crossroads. Ujjain in central India, positioned along important trade routes connecting northern and southern regions, and Suvarnagiri in the south, whose name, meaning Golden Mountain, suggests a connection to the mineral wealth of the region it governed. Communication across such distances relied on a network of roads, along which royal messengers, merchants, and officials traveled, carrying news, tax revenues, and administrative instructions between the capital at Pataliputra and the provincial centers. The pace of this communication was, by modern standards, extraordinarily slow, with messages taking weeks to travel between distant parts of the empire, a reality that necessarily granted considerable autonomy to provincial governors in matters of day-to-day administration, while major policy decisions and significant matters of state remained under the authority of the central court. Within this administrative structure, taxation formed the essential lifeblood of the imperial system, just as it does in any large state. The Arthashastra describes an elaborate system of land taxation, typically calculated as a portion of agricultural production, along with taxes on trade, craft production, and various other economic activities. This revenue funded not only the royal court and administration, but also a substantial standing army, a feature of Mauryan governance that ancient sources consistently emphasize as remarkably large, even accounting for likely exaggeration in the specific numbers that survive in Greek and Roman accounts, which describe hundreds of thousands of infantry, tens of thousands of cavalry, thousands of war elephants, and thousands of chariots maintained by the Mauryan state. Let us pause here gently to consider the war elephant, an animal that held a particularly significant place in Mauryan military and cultural life, and indeed in Indian warfare more broadly for many centuries, both before and after this period. Elephants were captured from wild populations, particularly in forested regions, and trained over extended periods by skilled handlers, a profession requiring considerable expertise passed down through specialized communities. In battle, elephants served multiple purposes, providing an elevated platform from which archers and other soldiers could fight, using their sheer size and strength to break enemy formations, and importantly, serving a significant psychological role, as their presence alone could unsettle opposing soldiers and horses unfamiliar with such animals, as had reportedly been the case for some of Alexander's own troops when they encountered war elephants during his Indian campaign years earlier. Beyond their military role, elephants also served important ceremonial and practical purposes throughout Mauryan society, used in construction projects requiring the movement of heavy materials, and appearing in royal processions and religious ceremonies as symbols of royal authority, and in Buddhist iconography that was becoming increasingly significant during this era, as symbols connected to the Buddha's own birth story, in which his mother Maya is said to have dreamed of a white elephant before his conception. Beyond matters of army and administration, Bindusara's reign, though sparsely documented in terms of specific events, must have encompassed the ordinary continuation of the agricultural, craft, and trade patterns we discussed in our previous chapter. Now extended across an even wider territorial expanse than his father had governed. The southward expansion of Mauryan authority during this period would have brought the empire's administrative and economic systems into contact with the different ecological and cultural zones of the Deccan Plateau, a region with its own distinct patterns of agriculture, adapted to less reliable rainfall than the Gangetic plain, and relying more heavily on crops such as millet, along with its own traditions of craft production, including notably skilled metalworking traditions and access to valuable mineral resources, including iron, gold, and precious stones, that would have added considerably to the wealth flowing into the imperial treasury. Religious life during Bindusara's reign also continued to develop along the pluralistic lines established in earlier generations. Buddhism, Jainism, and various Brahmanical traditions continued to coexist, generally without the kind of systematic religious conflict that would characterize some later periods of world history, though this should not be romanticized into an image of perfect harmony, since tensions and rivalries between different religious and philosophical communities certainly existed, as reflected in surviving philosophical and religious texts from this era that engage in vigorous debate with rival traditions. Later Buddhist tradition remembers Bindusara as having had some association with a heterodox philosophical school known as the Ajivikas, a now largely vanished tradition that taught a philosophy of strict determinism. Though the depth and nature of his personal religious commitments remain genuinely uncertain to historians working from the fragmentary evidence available. It was during Bindusara's reign that his son, a prince who would eventually become one of the most consequential rulers in the history of the Indian subcontinent, was growing to adulthood. This prince, named Ashoka, appears in later tradition, particularly in Buddhist chronicles composed some centuries after his lifetime, as having been sent by his father to serve as a governor in various provincial capacities, including, according to some traditions, service at Taxila in the northwest, where local unrest apparently required the presence of an incapable administrator, and later at Ujjain in central India. These accounts, like much of what we know about Mauryan royal family life, come from sources written well after the events they describe, blending historical memory with the particular religious and moralizing purposes of the texts in which they survive, and so should be approached, as we have approached similar material throughout our journey tonight, with appropriate scholarly caution rather than treated as verified historical fact in every detail. What does seem clear, based on the eventual outcome, is that among Bindusara's several sons, it was Ashoka who ultimately succeeded to the Mauryan throne following his father's death, an event that later tradition places around 273 before the Common Era, though the exact date remains subject to some scholarly discussion, with the succession itself apparently involving a period of conflict among rival claimants to the throne, according to later Buddhist sources that describe, with varying degrees of detail and likely varying degrees of historical accuracy, a struggle between Ashoka and his brothers before his position as emperor was finally secured, an event some traditions place several years after Bindusara's actual death, suggesting a genuinely contested and gradual consolidation of power, rather than a smooth, immediate transition. As this chapter draws toward its close, let us hold gently in mind this image of transition, an empire grown vast under 2 generations of careful, patient rule, its administrative structures extending across an enormous and diverse territory, its trade networks weaving together the agricultural wealth of the Gangetic plain with the mineral riches of the Deccan. And now, as the reign of Bindusara comes to its end, a new ruler preparing to take the throne, a ruler whose reign would eventually take this story in a direction that neither Chandragupta nor Bindusara, nor perhaps anyone else in the ancient world, could have fully anticipated. We will turn to that young ruler and to the early years of his reign as our journey continues. Let us settle now into the early years of Ashoka's reign, approaching this new chapter of our story with the same slow, careful attention we have given to those before it. As your breathing continues to slow and the evening continues to deepen, allow yourself to picture the city of Pataliputra once more, now under the authority of a new emperor, a man whose later transformation would make him one of the most studied and admired rulers in all of ancient history, though the ruler we meet at the beginning of his reign was, in many respects, still very much a product of the militarized, expansionist world into which he had been born. Historians reconstruct the early portion of Ashoka's reign from a combination of sources, including later Buddhist chronicles composed in Sri Lanka, particularly texts known as the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa, along with a small number of references in other traditions, and most importantly, for establishing reliable historical fact, the emperor's own inscriptions, carved into rock faces and stone pillars across the subcontinent, which Ashoka himself commissioned during the later portion of his reign, and which represent one of the most remarkable bodies of primary source material to survive from the ancient world. These inscriptions, written in various regional scripts and languages, including Brahmi, Kharosthi, and in some northwestern examples, Greek and Aramaic, reflecting the linguistic diversity of the vast empire Ashoka governed, provide us with something exceedingly rare in ancient history: the ruler's own words, addressed directly to his subjects, describing his policies, his reflections, and in some cases, his own personal transformation. Before we reach that transformation, however, let us spend this chapter with the earlier Ashoka, the young emperor consolidating his authority over an empire already vast in scope. As mentioned in our previous chapter, later tradition suggests that Ashoka's path to the throne involved some degree of contest among his brothers, though the specific details, including a later and likely legendary tradition claiming that Ashoka had numerous half-brothers killed in order to secure his position, come from Buddhist chronicles written centuries after his reign, and composed with clear moralizing purposes, intended in part to emphasize the dramatic contrast between the supposedly violent young Ashoka and the peaceful, Dharma-following emperor he would later become. Historians generally treat the most extreme versions of these stories with considerable skepticism, recognizing them as likely exaggerated or even largely invented for religious and literary effect, while acknowledging that some genuine succession conflict, common enough in ancient monarchies generally, probably did occur. What we can say with greater confidence, based on Ashoka's own inscriptions and the broader pattern of Mauryan administration established under his father and grandfather, is that Ashoka inherited an empire already organized into an extensive administrative system, with provincial capitals at Taxila, Ujjain, Suvarnagiri, and according to some later evidence, Tozali in the eastern coastal region, each governed by officials responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, administering justice, and reporting to the central court at Pataliputra. Ashoka's own inscriptions describe a system of officials called Mahamadras, who served various administrative functions across the empire. And later in his reign, as we will discuss in a future chapter, a special category of officials specifically tasked with promoting the ethical and social policies that would come to define his later reign. Let us imagine gently what the coronation and early court of a Mauryan emperor might have looked like during this period, drawing on the descriptions preserved by Megasthenes regarding earlier Mauryan court life. Since the fundamental structures of court ceremony likely changed relatively little across these early Mauryan generations, ancient accounts describe elaborate royal processions, with the emperor appearing in public accompanied by soldiers, musicians, and attendants, riding either in a golden palanquin or upon an elephant adorned with ornaments, a display intended to convey the majesty and authority of imperial rule to the population. Within the palace itself, court life involved elaborate protocols governing access to the emperor, with various officials, according to Megasthenes' earlier account, serving specific functions related to the emperor's daily routine, his meals, his physical safety, and the administration of justice, which the emperor himself was expected to oversee personally in matters of significant importance, a responsibility that later Ashokan inscriptions suggest he took seriously throughout his reign, describing his efforts to ensure that judicial matters were handled promptly and fairly across the empire. The early Mauryan court also served as a center of intellectual and cultural life, drawing scholars, religious teachers, and philosophers from various traditions who sought royal patronage or simply engaged in the kind of philosophical debate and discussion that flourished in ancient Indian intellectual culture during this period. Sanskrit and Prakrit literary traditions, religious philosophy across Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical schools, and practical fields of knowledge, including medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, all found some degree of support and engagement within royal courts of this era. Even though much of the specific literary and scholarly production of Ashoka's early reign has not survived in a form we can directly examine today, leaving us to reconstruct this cultural dimension of his court more from general patterns of the era than from specific documented details of his own court in particular. Militarily, the early portion of Ashoka's reign appears to have continued the expansionist pattern established by his father and grandfather, consolidating and likely extending Mauryan authority across the already vast territories the empire controlled. It is worth taking a moment here to consider the sheer scale of what the Mauryan Empire had become by this point in its history, encompassing, according to the evidence of Ashoka's own inscriptions, which have been found at sites ranging from the northwest frontier regions of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, across the entire northern plain into central India, and southward into the Deccan Plateau, a territory of remarkable size and diversity, incorporating dozens of distinct linguistic, cultural, and religious communities under a single, if administratively decentralized, imperial authority. This diversity of the empire deserves our unhurried attention for a moment, because it speaks to a genuinely impressive achievement of ancient statecraft, whatever moral complexities may have attended its creation and maintenance. Within Mauryan territory lived speakers of numerous languages, including various Prakrit dialects that had developed from the older Vedic Sanskrit, along with Dravidian languages in southern regions bordering directly Mauryan-controlled territory, and in the northwestern frontier regions, communities with connections to Persian, Greek, and Central Asian cultural traditions, a legacy of the region's long history as a crossroads of civilizations, stretching back through the earlier Persian Achaemenid administration of parts of this region, through Alexander's brief campaign, and now incorporated into Mauryan rule. Religious diversity was similarly extensive, encompassing the various Brahmanical traditions rooted in Vedic religion, Buddhism, Jainism, the now largely vanished Ajivika tradition mentioned in our previous chapter, and numerous regional and folk religious practices that existed alongside these more textually documented traditions. Governing such diversity required, as it does in any large state, a degree of administrative flexibility and pragmatism, allowing considerable local autonomy in cultural and religious matters, while maintaining central authority over taxation, military affairs, and matters of broader imperial policy. This pattern, established under Chandragupta and Bindusara, and continued in the early years of Ashoka's reign, would become significantly more codified and, in important respects, more actively directed by imperial policy during the later portion of Ashoka's reign, as we will discuss in the chapters ahead, when Ashoka would begin actively using the machinery of the state to promote a particular set of ethical values across this vast and diverse territory. For now, though, let us remain with the young emperor as he continued the pattern of Mauryan expansion, a pattern that would lead, within the first decade of his reign, to a military campaign that would ultimately prove to be the turning point not only of his own life, but of the moral and political character of the empire he governed. And indeed, in the eyes of many historians and admirers across the centuries since, one of the most significant moments of ethical reflection recorded anywhere in ancient political history. That campaign was directed against a coastal kingdom to the southeast of the Mauryan heartland, a region known as Kalinga, corresponding roughly to the modern Indian state of Odisha along the eastern coast of the subcontinent. Kalinga, by the evidence available to historians, was a wealthy and independent kingdom, having apparently maintained its independence from Mauryan control, even as the empire expanded to encompass so much of the surrounding territory under Chandragupta and Bindusara. Its wealth derived significantly from its coastal position, which gave it access to maritime trade routes extending along the eastern coast of India, and increasingly during this period, toward Southeast Asia, connections that would continue to develop over subsequent centuries into the extensive cultural and religious exchange between India and Southeast Asian civilizations that characterizes so much of the region's later history. Kalinga's fertile coastal plains also supported substantial agricultural production, and the kingdom maintained, according to later accounts, a significant military force of its own, sufficient to have resisted incorporation into the Mauryan Empire during the reigns of Ashoka's father and grandfather. As we bring this chapter gently to its close, let us hold in mind this image: a young emperor ruling over an empire of extraordinary scale and diversity, having inherited both the administrative machinery and the militarized, expansionist ambitions of his father and grandfather. Now turning his attention toward this last significant independent kingdom on the eastern seaboard of the subcontinent, the decision to campaign against Kalinga and the consequences that would follow from it represent one of the most consequential episodes in ancient Indian history, and indeed in the broader history of political ethics anywhere in the ancient world. We will approach that episode slowly and carefully in the chapter ahead, treating it as this documentary treats all difficult subjects with calm, factual, and unhurried attention, free from dramatic embellishment, allowing the historical weight of what occurred to settle naturally into our understanding, rather than through any urgency of narration. We come now to a chapter that requires our gentlest attention, not because the events themselves were gentle, but because our purpose tonight is to understand history calmly, factually, and without unnecessary distress, even when the history in question involves difficult and sorrowful events. Let your breathing remain slow, and even as we approach this part of the story together, according to Ashoka's own inscriptions, particularly a set of texts historians refer to as the major rock edicts, and specifically Rock Edict 13, the Mauryan campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga took place approximately 8 years after Ashoka's coronation, placing the event around 261 before the Common Era. Though as with many dates from this period, some scholarly discussion exists regarding the precise year. What makes this particular military campaign so significant to historians is not primarily its scale, considerable though that scale evidently was, but rather the fact that Ashoka himself, in his own words, preserved on stone for people across his empire, and for us today, described the campaign and its consequences with striking and unusual honesty. In Rock Edict 13, Ashoka states that during the conquest of Kalinga, a very large number of people were killed. A very large number died from causes connected to the conflict beyond direct combat, and a very large number were taken captive and deported. The specific numbers given in the edict: 150,000 deported, 100,000 killed in the fighting itself, and many times that number who died afterward from causes the edict attributes to the broader devastation of war are difficult for modern historians to verify with precision, and scholars generally treat ancient casualty figures of this kind with appropriate caution regarding their exact accuracy, recognizing that such numbers in ancient texts often served rhetorical as much as strictly documentary purposes. What historians do generally accept, based on the consistency and detail of Ashoka's own account, is that the human cost of this campaign was very substantial, involving significant loss of life, displacement, and suffering among the population of Kalinga. Consequences that Ashoka himself, remarkably for an ancient ruler, chose not to minimize or hide from his subjects, but instead recorded and reflected upon publicly. This is, in itself, a genuinely unusual feature of ancient political history. Rulers across the ancient world, and indeed across much of human history more broadly, have generally used public inscriptions and monuments to celebrate military victories, emphasizing their own glory, courage, and the scale of their triumph over defeated enemies. Ashoka's Rock Edict 13 does something markedly different. In it, the emperor describes feeling profound remorse for the suffering caused by the Kalinga campaign, stating that the thought of the killing, death, and displacement of people weighed heavily upon him, and that this reflection led him toward a significant reorientation of his understanding of what conquest, and indeed what kingship itself ought to mean. Let us sit with this moment gently, because it represents a genuinely rare instance in ancient history of a powerful ruler publicly and permanently recording an expression of moral reflection and, in significant respects, regret regarding the consequences of his own military action. Historians continue to discuss and interpret the precise nature and sincerity of this reflection, since we naturally cannot access Ashoka's inner emotional life directly. Only the words he chose to have carved into stone and distributed across his empire, words that certainly also served political and administrative purposes beyond simple personal confession, including the promotion of a new set of governing principles that Ashoka would spend the remainder of his reign attempting to implement. Nonetheless, the specific content and tone of this edict, combined with the broader pattern of policy changes that followed it, which we will explore in the chapters ahead, lead most historians to regard the Kalinga campaign as a genuine turning point in Ashoka's reign. Whatever combination of personal conviction and political calculation ultimately shaped his subsequent choices, it is worth pausing here to consider what we can reasonably understand about the experience of the people of Kalinga themselves during this campaign. Even though our primary surviving source, Ashoka's own edict, naturally centers the perspective of the conquering emperor rather than that of the conquered population. Kalinga, as we discussed in the previous chapter, was a wealthy, agriculturally productive coastal kingdom with access to significant maritime trade. A military campaign of the scale suggested by Ashoka's edict would have involved not only the direct violence of battle between Mauryan forces and Kalingan defenders, but also the broader disruptions that ancient warfare typically brought to civilian populations, including displacement from homes and farmland, disruption of agricultural cycles that communities depended upon for survival, and the deportation of large numbers of people, likely including skilled craftspeople and others whose labor and knowledge the Mauryan state may have sought to incorporate into its own territories. A practice not uncommon in ancient warfare across many civilizations. We should acknowledge calmly and without dwelling unnecessarily on painful details that ancient warfare of this era, in India as in other parts of the ancient world, involved real human suffering that we ought not minimize even as we maintain the gentle, peaceful tone appropriate to this evening's purpose. Families were separated. Homes and agricultural land were damaged or destroyed. Communities that had existed for generations experienced profound disruption to their way of life. It is precisely this human cost, acknowledged in Ashoka's own words, that appears to have prompted the significant reconsideration of governing philosophy that would characterize the remainder of his reign. A reconsideration that, as we will see, led not to a rejection of imperial authority itself, but to a deliberate and, in the context of ancient world history, quite remarkable attempt to redirect the exercise of that authority toward different ends. Following the conquest, Kalinga was incorporated into the Mauryan Empire, becoming, according to later evidence, including Ashoka's own inscriptions found within the region, a Mauryan province governed from administrative centers established there, with evidence suggesting Tozali served as an important administrative center for the newly incorporated territory. The population of Kalinga, like other populations across the diverse Mauryan Empire, would have gradually become integrated into the broader administrative, economic, and, as we will discuss, ethical framework that Ashoka began actively promoting across his territories in the years following the campaign. In Rock Edict 13, Ashoka goes on to articulate what historians regard as a genuinely significant shift in imperial philosophy, stating his intention to pursue what he calls conquest through Dharma, a term that carries a complex range of meanings across Indian religious and philosophical traditions, generally encompassing ideas of righteous conduct, ethical duty, natural law, and moral order, rather than continuing to pursue territorial expansion through military conquest. He expresses in this edict a wish that his descendants would similarly refrain from seeking glory through military conquest, and would instead consider conquest through Dharma, meaning the winning of hearts and minds through ethical example and righteous governance rather than force of arms, as the only form of conquest truly worth pursuing. This is a remarkable statement for any ancient ruler to have made, and it is worth our unhurried consideration tonight, not to render any final judgment on the complex historical figure who made it, since historians rightly caution against treating Ashoka's later reign as a simple, complete transformation into a figure of pure pacifism, a characterization that oversimplifies both the man and the historical record, since the Mauryan state under Ashoka continued to maintain its army and its authority, including, as some of his own edicts make clear, an implicit willingness to use force against internal unrest or external threats when the emperor deemed it necessary. Rather, what the historical evidence supports is a genuine and significant reorientation of stated imperial priorities away from active military expansion and toward an ambitious program of ethical governance, public welfare, and religious and moral instruction. A program we will explore in considerable depth across the chapters ahead. As this difficult but important chapter draws to its gentle close, let us allow ourselves a slow, calming breath. The events we have discussed tonight were sorrowful, and we have not sought to hide that sorrow, only to describe it with the calm, factual restraint appropriate to a peaceful evening's reflection on history. What emerged from this sorrow, as we will see in the chapters that follow, was one of the most distinctive and, in many respects, admirable programs of governance recorded anywhere in the ancient world. A program rooted in a ruler's public acknowledgement of the human cost of his own actions and his subsequent attempt, however imperfect and however complicated by the ordinary compromises of political power, to govern his vast empire according to principles of compassion, tolerance, and the welfare of his subjects. We will turn to that transformation gently and thoroughly as our journey continues into the night. Let us continue now into the years that followed the Kalinga campaign, years during which Ashoka's reign took on a character quite distinct from the militarized expansion of his father, grandfather, and his own earlier years upon the throne. As we settle into this part of the story, let your body continue to relax more deeply, your thoughts continuing to soften and slow, much as history itself now begins to move in a gentler direction. In the years following the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka appears to have deepened his engagement with Buddhist teaching, though historians are careful to note that the precise timeline and nature of his personal religious conversion remain subjects of scholarly discussion. Pieced together from his own inscriptions, rather than from a single, clearly dated conversion narrative. In several of his edicts, Ashoka describes himself using the term Upasaka, indicating a lay follower of the Buddha's teachings, and in one inscription known as the Minor Rock Edict, he describes a period of increasingly serious commitment to Buddhist practice, including, according to this inscription, a visit to Bodh Gaya, the site traditionally associated with the Buddha's enlightenment, and support for the Buddhist monastic community, or Sangha. It is important, as we consider this religious dimension of Ashoka's later reign, to understand what the term Dharma meant within the specific context of his own inscriptions. Since this word carries different shades of meaning across different religious and philosophical traditions of ancient India, while Dharma in Buddhist contexts often refers specifically to the Buddha's teachings, Ashoka's own use of the term in his edicts, addressed as they were to a vast and religiously diverse population, including Buddhists, Jains, followers of various Brahmanical traditions, and others, appears deliberately broader and more inclusive, referring to a set of ethical principles that Ashoka hoped would resonate across religious boundaries, rather than promoting Buddhism specifically as a state religion in a manner that might have alienated his non-Buddhist subjects. This inclusive approach itself represents an important aspect of Ashoka's later governing philosophy, one we will explore further as we continue. The principles Ashoka articulated under this broad conception of Dharma, as recorded across his numerous edicts, included a consistent emphasis on nonviolence toward both human beings and animals, respect and generosity toward parents, elders, and teachers, kindness and generosity toward friends, relatives, and even strangers, proper and respectful treatment of servants and laborers, support for religious teachers and ascetics across different traditions, without favoritism toward any single school, and a general disposition toward truthfulness, self-control, and gratitude. These principles, while certainly resonant with core Buddhist ethical teachings were also broadly compatible with the ethical frameworks of Jainism and various Brahmanical traditions, reflecting Ashoka's apparent effort to articulate a set of values that could serve as common ethical ground across his empire's considerable religious diversity, rather than imposing a single sectarian framework upon populations who followed different faiths. One of the most historically significant aspects of Ashoka's later reign was his approach to religious tolerance, articulated with particular clarity in Rock Edict 12, in which he explicitly instructs respect for the doctrines of other religious communities, stating that whoever praises their own religion and criticizes other religions does so out of devotion to their own religion, thinking to glorify it, but in fact injures their own religion more gravely by such conduct, and that one should instead honor other religions for various reasons, thereby helping one's own religion to grow, while also benefiting the religions of others. This articulation of religious tolerance and pluralism, inscribed on stone across an empire, spanning much of the Indian subcontinent more than 2,000 years ago, is regarded by many historians and scholars of religious history as a genuinely remarkable early expression of principles that would not become widely established in many other parts of the world for many centuries afterward. And it remains, to this day, studied and admired as an early articulation of interfaith respect, emerging from within a position of considerable political power, rather than from a position of religious minority seeking accommodation. Let us now consider some of the concrete policies through which Ashoka attempted to translate these ethical principles into the actual governance of his vast empire. Because Dharma, in Ashoka's conception, was not intended merely as private religious sentiment, but as an active governing philosophy meant to shape public policy and administration. According to his edicts, Ashoka established a new category of officials known as Dharma Mahamatras, whose specific responsibility was to travel across the empire promoting ethical conduct, addressing matters of religious welfare across different communities, ensuring fair treatment of prisoners, and generally serving as agents of the ethical program Ashoka sought to implement. A genuinely significant administrative innovation representing the creation of what we might, with appropriate care about applying modern terminology to an ancient context, describe as something resembling a department of public morality and welfare, embedded within the existing structure of Mauryan provincial administration. Ashoka's edicts also describe a range of concrete welfare measures undertaken during this period of his reign. He describes the planting of banyan trees and mango groves along roads to provide shade for travelers and animals, the digging of wells at regular intervals along major routes, and the establishment of rest houses for travelers. Infrastructure investments that would have made travel across the empire considerably more comfortable and humane for merchants, pilgrims, officials, and ordinary travelers moving along the extensive road network connecting Mauryan territories. Also describes, in Rock Edict 2, the establishment of medical treatment facilities for both humans and animals across his own territories, and remarkably, in neighboring kingdoms as well, including, according to the edict, treatment centers established in the territories of various Hellenistic rulers to the west, with whom Mauryan diplomatic relations continued during this period, along with the provision and cultivation of medicinal herbs and roots in places where they did not naturally grow, imported specifically for their healing properties, representing an ambitious attempt at what might be described as public health policy, extending even beyond the emperor's own political borders. Animal welfare receives particular and sustained attention across several of Ashoka's edicts, reflecting the influence of Buddhist and Jain principles of nonviolence upon his broader ethical philosophy. In several inscriptions, Ashoka describes restrictions on animal sacrifice within the royal kitchens, describing a significant reduction in the number of animals killed for the emperor's own table compared to previous practice. And in Pillar Edict 5, he provides a remarkably detailed list of specific animal species protected from slaughter on certain days, along with broader restrictions on hunting and fishing during particular periods, and prohibitions against certain particularly cruel practices, such as the branding of animals or the mutilation of certain creatures for decorative or other purposes, while historians note that these measures did not amount to complete prohibition on meat consumption or animal use across Mauryan society. And Ashoka's own edicts suggest he himself continued to permit some meat in the royal kitchen even while reducing it. The overall pattern reflects a genuinely significant royal commitment to reducing animal suffering across the empire, communicated through the same public inscriptional program used to promote his broader ethical agenda. It is worth taking a moment here to consider how these edicts themselves were physically created and distributed, because the sheer scale of this communicative project deserves our appreciation as we consider the practical challenges of governance in the ancient world. Ashoka's inscriptions, more than 30 of which survive today across the Indian subcontinent and into parts of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, were carved into large rock surfaces at 14 major sites, known to historians as the major rock edicts, and onto tall, elegantly carved sandstone pillars, some of which still stand today, remarkable examples of ancient stone carving and architectural achievement, topped in several cases by beautifully sculpted animal capitals, including the famous lion capital that once stood atop the pillar at Sarnath, the site traditionally associated with the Buddha's first sermon, an image that modern India would eventually adopt as its national emblem many centuries later, a detail that speaks to the enduring resonance of Ashoka's legacy across the long span of Indian history. The technical achievement represented by these pillars deserves our quiet admiration as well. Carved from single blocks of sandstone, some quarried in the region of Chunar near the Ganges, and transported significant distances to their final locations. These pillars display a level of stone polishing technique, achieving a remarkably smooth, almost mirror-like finish that has genuinely impressed modern engineers, architects, and art historians who have studied the surviving examples, representing a level of craftsmanship that speaks to the considerable resources, skilled labor, and technical knowledge available to the Mauryan state during this period. The inscriptions themselves were written primarily in Prakrit, the everyday spoken language of most of Ashoka's subjects, rather than the more formal and less widely understood Sanskrit, using the Brahmi script in most of the empire and the Kharosthi script in the northwestern regions, where that script was more familiar to local populations. While in the far northwestern territories bordering the Hellenistic world, some inscriptions appear in Greek and Aramaic as well, reflecting a genuinely thoughtful attention to reaching diverse linguistic communities across the empire in languages and scripts they could actually understand. Rather than imposing a single administrative language uniformly across all territories, a detail that further illustrates the pragmatic, accommodating character of Ashoka's approach to governing his remarkably diverse realm. As we bring this chapter gently toward its close, let us hold in mind this image of transformation. An emperor who had once pursued the same pattern of military expansion as his father and grandfather before him, now devoting the considerable resources and administrative reach of his vast empire toward an ambitious program of ethical instruction, public welfare, religious tolerance, and care for both human subjects and animal life across his territories. In our next chapter, we will continue to explore the practical dimensions of Ashokan governance, including his approach to administration, law, and the daily welfare of ordinary people across this vast and diverse empire. Before turning our attention once more to the everyday textures of life during this later, more settled period of Mauryan rule, let us continue now gently into the practical machinery of governance during Ashoka's later reign, exploring how the ethical vision we discussed in our previous chapter translated into the everyday administration of a vast and complex empire. As always, let this exploration wash over you slowly, without any need to retain every detail, simply allowing the shape and texture of this ancient system of governance to settle peacefully into your mind as you continue drifting toward rest. Ashoka's inscriptions reveal a ruler deeply concerned with the fair and humane administration of justice across his territories, a concern that appears repeatedly across several edicts. In Pillar Edict 4, he addresses the conduct of the Rajukas, officials responsible for judicial administration at the local level, granting them a degree of independent authority in rendering judgments and administering rewards and punishments, while also establishing certain protections for those convicted of crimes, including, according to this edict, a period of grace before execution of death sentences, during which condemned prisoners were permitted to make donations for religious merit or observe fasting, and during which their relatives could appeal on their behalf. A genuinely notable provision suggesting an ancient ruler's concern with tempering the harshness of capital punishment with at least some measure of procedural consideration and compassion, even while the death penalty itself remained part of the Mauryan legal system. Since Ashoka's reforms, as historians consistently note, represented a moderation and humanization of existing practices, rather than a wholesale abolition of the coercive and sometimes harsh legal framework inherited from earlier Mauryan administration. The emperor also describes, in several edicts, his own personal commitment to being accessible to matters of state and petition at all times, stating in Rock Edict 6 that he had instructed his officials to report to him on public business at any time, regardless of whether he was eating in his private apartments, in his inner chambers, engaged in religious observance, or even, according to the rather charming detail preserved in this edict, in his private garden, reflecting an apparent determination to remain personally engaged with the welfare and concerns of his subjects, despite the vast scale of the empire he governed. A claim that, like other self-descriptions in royal inscriptions across history, we should receive with appropriate awareness that rulers naturally present their own conduct in a favorable light, while still recognizing the genuine significance of a ruler publicly committing himself in a permanent and widely distributed inscription to this standard of accessibility and diligence, beyond matters of justice and personal governance. Ashoka's edicts describe a range of specific instructions regarding the treatment of different populations across his diverse empire. In Kalinga, specifically, the region conquered through the campaign we discussed in our earlier chapter, a separate set of inscriptions, known as the Kalinga Edicts, addresses local administrators directly, instructing them to treat the population with fairness and compassion, explicitly stating that all people are as Ashoka's own children, and instructing officials to avoid unjust imprisonment or harsh treatment of the local population, language that many historians read as a direct and continuing expression of the emperor's reflection upon the suffering caused by the original conquest of this region, an attempt to ensure that the newly incorporated territory would be governed according to the more compassionate principles Ashoka had come to embrace following the campaign. Ashoka's edicts also reveal his engagement with regions beyond the direct borders of his own empire, describing diplomatic and religious missions sent to various Hellenistic kingdoms to the west, including, according to Rock Edict 13, the courts of Antiochus II of the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemy II of Egypt, Antigonus II Gonatas of Macedonia, Magas of Cyrene, and Alexander of Epirus, rulers whose historical existence and approximate dates are well established through independent Greek and Roman sources, providing valuable external corroboration for the general chronological framework of Ashoka's reign. Even though we lack independent confirmation from the Hellenistic side regarding the specific nature or reception of these missions, Ashoka describes these missions as promoting the practice of Dharma, understood in the broad ethical sense we discussed in our previous chapter, in these distant lands, suggesting an ambitious vision of ethical outreach, extending well beyond the political borders of his own considerable empire. Perhaps most historically significant among Ashoka's outreach efforts, according to later Buddhist tradition, preserved particularly in Sri Lankan chronicles, was the mission he is said to have sent to Sri Lanka, an island kingdom to the south of the Indian subcontinent, led by a figure remembered as Mahinda, described in these traditions as Ashoka's own son, who brought Buddhist teachings to the island, and is credited, according to Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition, with establishing Buddhism as a major religious tradition there, a tradition that continues to flourish in Sri Lanka to this day, and represents one of the most historically significant and lasting consequences of Ashoka's reign, illustrating how the religious and cultural transformations of this period would extend their influence across Asia for many centuries following the end of the Mauryan Empire itself, into regions and eras far beyond what Ashoka himself could have witnessed. Historians note that while the broad outline of Buddhist transmission to Sri Lanka during roughly this period enjoys reasonable historical support, some specific details in the later chronicle accounts, including certain elements of Mahinda's personal story, were likely elaborated by later tradition in ways characteristic of religious historical writing more broadly. Let us turn our attention now, gently, to how ordinary administrative life across the empire might have felt during this later, more settled period of Ashoka's reign. The provincial governors and their administrative staffs, based in centers such as Taxila, Ujjain, Suvarnagiri, and Tozali, as discussed in our earlier chapters, continued the essential work of tax collection, maintenance of order, and local administration, now operating within a framework that increasingly emphasized, at least in official rhetoric and apparent policy direction from the imperial center, humane and ethical conduct toward the populations they governed. The Dharma Mahamatras discussed in our previous chapter would have traveled through towns and villages, addressing local officials and populations, promoting the ethical principles articulated in Ashoka's edicts, and presumably serving some oversight function regarding the treatment of different communities, including religious minorities, prisoners, the elderly, and others, whose welfare Ashoka's edicts specifically address. For ordinary farmers, craftspeople, and merchants across the empire, life would have continued to follow the essential rhythms we described in our earlier chapter on daily life. Agricultural cycles governed by monsoon rains, craft production organized through guild-like associations, trade flowing along the network of roads and rivers, connecting the empire's various regions, though now, potentially, experiencing some tangible benefits from Ashoka's specific welfare policies, including the shade trees and wells planted along major roads, the rest houses established for travelers, and for those who fell ill, access to the medical treatment facilities his edicts describe as established across the empire. Whether these policies were implemented with full consistency and effectiveness across every corner of such a vast and administratively decentralized empire remains naturally difficult for historians to verify with complete confidence, since the survival of Ashoka's own inscriptions describing his intentions and policies does not guarantee uniform implementation across every province and district. A gap between stated policy and lived reality that exists in virtually every large political system throughout history, ancient or modern. Religious life during this period continued its pluralistic character, with Ashoka's edicts explicitly supporting and providing patronage to multiple religious traditions simultaneously, including donations and support for Buddhist monastic communities, Brahmanical religious institutions, Jain communities, and the Ajivika tradition, evidenced by inscriptions found in caves in the Barabar Hills near Pataliputra, which Ashoka's own inscriptions indicate were donated specifically for use by Ajivika ascetics, providing archaeological confirmation of his broader policy of religious pluralism, extending even to traditions outside his own personal Buddhist practice. This pattern of multi-religious patronage represents a genuinely significant historical example of a powerful ruler actively supporting religious diversity, rather than favoring his own faith exclusively. A policy choice that many historians regard as contributing to the relatively peaceful coexistence of multiple religious traditions across much of Indian history during this era. Though again, we should be careful not to romanticize this period into an image of complete and uniform harmony, since regional and social tensions between different communities certainly continued to exist alongside this broader imperial policy of tolerance. As this chapter draws gently toward its close, let us hold in mind this fuller picture of Ashoka's later governance. A ruler who, having reflected upon the suffering caused by his earlier military campaign, devoted the considerable administrative machinery of his empire toward an ambitious, if naturally imperfect, program of humane governance, religious tolerance, public welfare, and outreach extending across and even beyond the borders of his vast territory. In our next chapter, we will return once more to the daily lives of ordinary people across the empire during this later Mauryan period, exploring the art, architecture, and material culture that flourished during these years. Before beginning, in the chapters that follow to consider the eventual decline of the Mauryan Empire and the long legacy it left behind across the subsequent centuries of South Asian history. Let us rest now within the art, architecture, and material culture of this later Mauryan period, allowing ourselves to simply wander, as though through the quiet galleries of a museum after closing hours. Among the physical traces this civilization left behind, traces that archaeologists and art historians have spent generations carefully studying and interpreting. We have already spoken, in an earlier chapter, of the remarkable Ashokan pillars, those tall, elegantly proportioned sandstone columns carved from single blocks of stone and finished with a smooth, lustrous polish that continues to impress those who study them today. Let us linger a little longer with these pillars now, considering them not simply as vehicles for the emperor's edicts, but as significant artistic and architectural achievements in their own right. Each pillar was typically crowned with a capital, often featuring a lotus-shaped base supporting sculpted animal figures, most famously the 4 lions of the Sarnath pillar, seated back to back atop a circular abacus decorated with smaller relief carvings of a horse, a bull, an elephant, and a lion, separated by wheel motifs, all resting upon an inverted lotus, a composition of remarkable sophistication and technical skill that continues to be studied and admired by art historians for its confident handling of naturalistic animal form combined with symbolic and religious meaning drawn from Buddhist tradition, in which the lion in particular carries associations with the Buddha's own teaching, sometimes described metaphorically as a lion's roar. The stylistic origins and influences visible in these pillars have long fascinated scholars who note certain similarities to Persian Achaemenid architectural traditions, particularly in the general concept of a freestanding, animal-capped pillar, a connection that makes historical sense given the region's earlier history of contact with Persian imperial administration in the northwestern territories before Alexander's campaigns, while also displaying distinctly Indian artistic sensibilities in the naturalistic rendering of animal forms and the integration of specifically Buddhist symbolic content, suggesting a genuinely original artistic synthesis rather than simple imitation of foreign models, a pattern of creative adaptation that would characterize Indian art across many subsequent centuries as it continued to engage with influences arriving from Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean world through ongoing trade and diplomatic contact. Beyond the pillars themselves, this period saw significant developments in religious architecture, particularly connected to the growing prominence of Buddhism under Ashoka's patronage. The stupa, a dome-shaped structure typically containing relics associated with the Buddha or other significant religious figures, became an increasingly important form of religious architecture during this period, with tradition holding that Ashoka was responsible for the construction or expansion of numerous stupas across his empire, including, according to later tradition, an ambitious project involving the redistribution of relics originally associated with the Buddha across a great many stupas throughout his territories. A tradition historians treat with some caution regarding its precise historical accuracy in every detail, while recognizing the broader pattern of Ashokan patronage for Buddhist architectural and religious infrastructure, as well documented through both textual and archaeological evidence. The great stupa at Sanchi, located in central India, though its most famous surviving decorative elements, including its elaborately carved gateways, date from somewhat later centuries, following further expansion and embellishment after the Mauryan period, is generally understood to have originated in its core structure during Ashoka's reign, representing one of the most important surviving examples of early Buddhist architecture in India, and offering modern visitors and scholars alike a tangible connection to this ancient period of religious and artistic flourishing. Its serene dome and surrounding pathway for ritual circumambulation embodying, in physical architectural form, the same principles of calm, contemplative religious practice that Ashoka's edicts sought to promote across his empire. Let us also spend a few moments considering the urban environment of this later Mauryan period, returning briefly to Pataliputra, the imperial capital we described in an earlier chapter, but now imagining it several decades further into its development, grown even larger and more elaborate under the patronage of an empire that had, by this point, controlled and drawn resources from nearly the entire Indian subcontinent for multiple generations. Archaeological excavations conducted near modern Patna have revealed evidence of sophisticated wooden architecture, including substantial pillared halls that likely served administrative or ceremonial functions, along with drainage systems designed to manage the seasonal flooding common to a city situated at the confluence of two major rivers. Engineering achievements that speak to a genuinely sophisticated urban planning tradition. Even though, as we noted earlier, much of the ancient city remains difficult to excavate fully given its location beneath the modern city that occupies the same site today. Beyond Pataliputra, other cities across the empire, including Taxila in the northwest, Ujjain in central India, and various other provincial centers, developed their own distinctive urban characters, shaped by local geography, trade connections, and cultural traditions, while sharing certain common features typical of ancient Indian urbanism during this period, including planned street layouts in some cases, markets organized around specific craft or trade specializations, religious structures serving the diverse faith communities present in each city, and residential quarters reflecting the social and economic stratification typical of ancient urban societies more broadly. Taxila, in particular, continued during this period to serve as a significant center of learning, drawing students and scholars from across the region and beyond, engaging with fields of study, including medicine, philosophy, grammar, and various other branches of knowledge, continuing a tradition of scholarship that had already made the city renowned even before its incorporation into the Mauryan Empire, and that would continue to shape its reputation for centuries following the Mauryan period as well. Let us turn our thoughts gently to matters of everyday material culture during this later Mauryan period. The kinds of small, personal objects that connect us most directly and intimately to the lives of ordinary people from this distant era. Archaeological excavations across Mauryan era sites have recovered a wide range of such objects, including terracotta figurines, often depicting female figures associated with fertility and household deities, suggesting the continued importance of popular religious practice, alongside the more formally documented traditions of Buddhism, Jainism, and Brahmanical religion that dominate our textual sources. These terracotta figures, along with small toys, gaming pieces, and personal ornaments, including beads made from carnelian, agate, glass, and other materials, offer us a gentle and intimate window into the everyday aesthetic and spiritual lives of people who left behind no written records of their own. Unlike the emperors and religious institutions, whose inscriptions and monuments have survived so much more prominently in the historical record, coinage during this period also developed in interesting and historically significant ways, with punch-marked silver coins, a distinctive form of currency featuring various symbols stamped onto irregular pieces of silver, circulating widely across the Mauryan Empire, facilitating the kind of extensive trade network we discussed in earlier chapters, connecting agricultural producers, craftspeople, and merchants across vast distances through a shared and recognized medium of exchange, representing an important economic infrastructure that supported the broader prosperity and administrative coherence of the empire. Music and performance also formed an important part of cultural life during this period, though our evidence for the specific musical traditions of Mauryan India is more limited than our evidence for architecture, religious practice, and material culture more broadly, coming primarily from later textual references and depictions in art from subsequent centuries that likely reflect, at least in part, traditions with roots extending back into this earlier period. Musical instruments, including various forms of drums, stringed instruments, and flutes, appear in artistic depictions from ancient India, and both religious and secular performance traditions, including dance, appear to have played significant roles in festival celebrations, religious observance, and court entertainment throughout this era, contributing to the rich cultural texture of daily life that existed alongside the more frequently documented political and religious history of the period. Festivals, too, punctuated the calendar of ordinary life during this period, connected both to agricultural cycles, celebrating planting and harvest at various points throughout the year, and to religious observances associated with the diverse faith traditions present across the empire, including Buddhist festivals connected to significant moments in the Buddha's life and teaching, Jain observances, and the numerous festivals associated with Brahmanical and popular religious traditions, celebrations that would have brought communities together for shared meals, music, and religious ritual, providing moments of collective joy and connection within the broader rhythm of agricultural and administrative life that structured the year for most people across the empire. As we bring this chapter gently to its close, let us hold in mind this rich and textured picture of later Mauryan civilization. Elegant stone pillars rising above the landscape, their smooth surfaces catching the light of morning and evening. Graceful stupas offering quiet spaces for religious contemplation. Bustling cities with their markets, scholars, and administrative halls. And throughout it all, the countless small, personal objects and daily practices of ordinary people, their toys and ornaments, their coins and festivals, their music, and their quiet domestic lives, all forming the true substance of this remarkable civilization at what many historians regard as one of its most accomplished and, in certain respects, admirable periods. In our next and following chapters, we will begin to trace the gradual decline of this great empire and consider the long legacy it left behind across the many centuries of history that followed. As our journey approaches its final chapter this evening, let us follow the Mauryan Empire gently into its later years, tracing the slow process by which even the greatest and most accomplished ancient states eventually give way to change. A pattern as natural and inevitable in its own way as the turning of the seasons we have spoken of so often tonight. Ashoka's reign, according to the chronological framework historians have pieced together primarily from his own inscriptions and their internal dating references, lasted approximately 37 years, placing his death sometime around 232 before the Common Era. Though, as with many dates from this period, some scholarly discussion continues regarding the precise year. The final years of his reign are less thoroughly documented than the periods we have explored in our recent chapters, and historians note that his very last inscriptions suggest a continued commitment to the principles of Dharma he had articulated throughout the later portion of his rule, without indicating any significant departure from the governing philosophy he had adopted following the Kalinga campaign. The succession following Ashoka's death and the subsequent decades of Mauryan history present historians with a genuinely more fragmentary and difficult body of evidence than the well-documented reigns of Chandragupta, Bindusara, and Ashoka himself. Various later textual traditions, including Buddhist chronicles, the Puranas, a genre of Sanskrit texts recording dynastic genealogies and religious material, and other fragmentary sources, offer somewhat differing accounts of the rulers who succeeded Ashoka, with some traditions suggesting the empire may have been divided between different successors or claimants, a pattern of succession difficulty not uncommon in large ancient empires following the death of a particularly long-reigning and dominant ruler. Historians generally agree that the decades following Ashoka's death saw a gradual weakening of central Mauryan authority, though the specific causes, sequence of events, and pace of this decline remain subjects of ongoing scholarly discussion and reconstruction from limited evidence. Several factors are generally considered by historians to have contributed to this gradual decline. And let us consider them slowly, one at a time, as we would examine the individual pieces of a larger and more complex historical puzzle. The sheer scale and administrative decentralization of the empire, which we discussed in earlier chapters as a genuine achievement of Mauryan governance, may also have contained the seeds of eventual fragmentation, since provincial governors, particularly those from the royal family stationed at distant centers such as Taxila and Ujjain, held considerable independent authority that could, under weaker central leadership, translate into effective independence or even outright rebellion against the authority of Pataliputra. Economic pressures may also have played a role, with some historians suggesting that the extensive welfare programs, religious patronage, and public infrastructure projects associated with Ashoka's later reign, however admirable in their humanitarian aims, may have placed significant strain on imperial finances over time, particularly once combined with the reduced revenue that might have resulted from Ashoka's own move away from active military expansion and the conquest of new tribute-paying territories, though this economic interpretation remains one hypothesis among several, rather than a definitively established historical fact. And other historians place greater emphasis on political and administrative factors rather than purely economic explanations for the empire's decline. The traditional account of the Mauryan dynasty's final end, preserved in later Sanskrit sources, including the Puranas, holds that the last Mauryan ruler, a king remembered by the name Brihadratha, was overthrown around 185 before the Common Era by his own military commander, a general named Pushyamitra Shunga, who then established a new dynasty, the Shunga dynasty, which would rule over a somewhat reduced territory compared to the height of Mauryan power, centered still in the Gangetic plain, but no longer commanding the vast, subcontinent-spanning authority that Ashoka had once held. Some later Buddhist textual traditions describe Pushyamitra Shunga in quite unfavorable terms, associating him with persecution of Buddhist institutions, though historians treat these particular claims with some caution, recognizing that they come from Buddhist sources that may have had their own reasons, whether based on genuine historical grievance or rhetorical and religious motivation, for portraying the founder of a new, non-Buddhist patronizing dynasty in a negative light, a reminder that even our historical sources themselves carry the perspectives and interests of the communities that produced and preserved them. Whatever the precise sequence of events, by the early 2nd century before the Common Era, the unified Mauryan Empire that Chandragupta had founded, that Bindusara had expanded, and that Ashoka had governed according to his distinctive vision of ethical rule, had given way to a more fragmented political landscape across the Indian subcontinent, with various regional kingdoms, including the Shungas in the Gangetic heartland and other dynasties emerging in different regions, inheriting portions of the vast territory the Mauryas had once unified under a single administration. It is worth pausing here gently to consider what this transition might have meant for ordinary people living through it. The farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and families whose daily lives we have spent so much of this documentary exploring. Political transitions of this kind, even when they involve genuine instability and conflict at the level of ruling elites and military campaigns between rival claimants, do not necessarily transform the fundamental rhythms of ordinary agricultural, craft, and community life as dramatically or as immediately as the dynastic and political narrative might suggest. Villages continued to plant and harvest according to the monsoon's rhythm. Craftspeople continued to produce pottery, textiles, and metalwork according to traditions passed down through generations. Trade routes, though perhaps disrupted in certain periods and regions by political instability, generally continued to function, connecting communities across the subcontinent in patterns that had developed over centuries and would continue to evolve across the many centuries still to come. The cultural and religious legacy of the Mauryan period, and particularly of Ashoka's distinctive reign, proved considerably more durable than the specific political unity the dynasty had achieved. Buddhism, which had received such significant royal patronage under Ashoka, continued to flourish and spread, not only within India itself, but, as we discussed in an earlier chapter, into Sri Lanka, and over the following centuries into Central Asia, China, and eventually across much of East and Southeast Asia, carried along trade routes, and through the efforts of missionaries and pilgrims in a process that would fundamentally shape the religious and cultural landscape of a large portion of the Asian continent for the following 2,000 years and beyond. A legacy whose ultimate scale and duration Ashoka himself, standing before his own inscribed pillars in the 3rd century before the Common Era, could hardly have fully anticipated, even with the ambitious vision of ethical outreach he articulated in his own edicts. The physical monuments of Ashoka's reign, the pillars, the stupas, and the rock edicts scattered across the subcontinent, endured across the centuries that followed, some remaining visible and legible, others gradually buried, forgotten, or reused for different purposes, as political and religious landscapes continued to shift across the long span of Indian history. It was only in the modern era, beginning particularly in the 19th century, that European and Indian scholars, working together to decipher the ancient Brahmi script in which most of Ashoka's edicts were written, a decipherment achieved substantially through the careful scholarly work of James Prinsep in the 1830s, gradually rediscovered and reconstructed the full scope of Ashoka's reign and his remarkable program of ethical governance, a rediscovery that transformed Ashoka from a relatively obscure figure, known previously mainly through fragmentary and sometimes legendary Buddhist textual traditions, into one of the most celebrated and admired rulers in the entire span of ancient world history, studied today not only by historians of ancient India, but by scholars of political philosophy, religious studies, and the history of human rights and governance more broadly, who continue to find in his edicts a genuinely remarkable ancient articulation of principles, including religious tolerance, humane governance, and public welfare that resonate in important respects with values many societies continue to strive toward in the present day. As our long journey through the Mauryan world draws now toward its quiet close, let us take a final, slow look back across everything we have explored together this evening, the wide river plains of the Gangetic heartland where our story began, the patient rise of Chandragupta and his mentor Chanakya, the vast administrative and economic achievements of the early Mauryan state, the daily lives of countless farmers, craftspeople, and families whose names have not survived, but whose labor and quiet dignity formed the true foundation of this ancient civilization, the sorrowful campaign against Kalinga, and the remarkable moral reflection it prompted in a young emperor, the ambitious and, in many respects, genuinely admirable program of ethical governance, religious tolerance, and public welfare that emerged from that reflection, the beautiful pillars and stupas that still stand today as physical witnesses to this ancient achievement. And finally, the gradual and gentle fading of this great empire into the wider flow of Indian history, a history that would continue across the many centuries that followed, to be shaped in countless ways by the legacy this remarkable dynasty left behind. And so, gently, our journey through the world of the Mauryas comes to its rest. The river still moves, slow and wide, toward a sea it has been reaching for longer than any empire has stood upon its banks. The stone pillars still stand, here and there, quiet and worn smooth by more than 2,000 years of wind and rain and passing seasons, their carved words growing fainter with each passing century, though never quite disappearing. Somewhere beneath the modern streets of Patna, the old timbers of Pataliputra rest undisturbed in the dark, patient earth, holding their silence. The rice still grows in the wide green paddies of the Gangetic plain, planted and harvested now by the distant descendants of the same patient hands that tended those fields so long ago. History does not truly end. It only grows quieter, settling slowly into the ground beneath our feet, becoming part of the soil from which new seasons continue to grow. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. Let the pillars and the rivers and the quiet fields fade gently from your thoughts now, the way mist lifts slowly from a valley in the first soft light of morning. Let your breathing stay slow. Let your body stay heavy and warm and still. You have wandered far tonight, across centuries and kingdoms, and now, at last, there is nowhere left